This presentation will seek to provide information on the processes that companies should follow for assessing whether they may be suitable to register under the R&D tax incentive, particularly for those companies conducting software-based activities. This can extend to not only software companies, but also those in other industries who may be developing software to facilitate R&D. This presentation has been based on an AusIndustry guidance publication titled Software Development Activities and the R&D Tax Incentive, which was released in October of 2020 and is available on the AusIndustry website. The R&D tax incentive operates on a self-assessment framework. Self-assessment means that companies lodge their R&D applications based on their own assessment of eligible activities, and may subsequently have to substantiate their activities at a later time if their registration is subjected to review. For the purposes of assessment of activities under the R&D tax incentive, activities that a company conducts may be either eligible core R&D activities, eligible supporting R&D activities, or ineligible activities not to be registered. In order to register eligible activities in a given year, a company must conduct or plan to conduct at least one eligible core R&D activity. The definition of eligible core R&D activities is specified in the income tax legislation. The legislation states that core R&D activities are experimental activities, whose outcome cannot be known or determined in advance on the basis of current knowledge, information, or experience, but can only be determined by applying systematic progression of work that is based on the principles of established science and proceeds from hypothesis to experiment, observation and evaluation, and leads to logical conclusions. And experimental activities are conducted for the purposes of generating new knowledge, including new knowledge in the form of new or improved materials, products, devices, processes, or services. If we're to break that down, a core R&D activity must involve a systematic progression of work, unknown outcomes, and the intention to generate new knowledge. Each of the requirements of the legislative definition must be met to qualify, and during compliance reviews, AusIndustry need to be satisfied that a company has met each relevant criterion. If a particular part of a project is not a core R&D activity, it may still qualify as a supporting R&D activity if directly related to a core R&D activity. The process of conducting a core R&D activity is particularly important, and applicants should sequentially assess and describe the hypothesis being tested, the design and setup of the experiment including key variables, observations, evaluation of results, and finally, logical conclusions made. The first element of the experiment is the hypothesis, which is the company's idea for a new product or process being investigated during experiments. A hypothesis should relate to a specific technical or scientific uncertainty or a set of related gaps that is being tested by an experiment. For example, you might find information from multiple sources stating that a particular compression algorithm can compress a 12 megapixel image but will exceed the power limits of existing processes. You might find other information that relates to methods of increasing the efficiency of compression algorithms so that they will work within existing power limitations. This might give you an idea about how to improve an existing compression algorithm so that it can achieve a particular result. For example, to compress a 12 megapixel image without exceeding the limits of the low power processor. Alternatively, you might have an idea about how to create a new algorithm. Your hypothesis will direct the design and conduct of your experiment. Experiments, for the purposes of R&D, involve a series of tasks that are undertaken in a planned and systematic way to evaluate a hypothesis. The experimental steps should be recorded in such a way that they can be understood or repeated by a competent professional in the field. Applicants should observe, measure, and record information and results that relate to the experiment using qualitative, i.e. descriptive information, or quantitative, numerical data. Then, the results of experiments should be evaluated through assessment and analysis. Applicants need to consider what the results of the experiment mean. From this, logical conclusions can be drawn about whether the results supported the hypothesis and why or why not. Where experiments do not yield the required results, the inputs to the experiments, such as the software code or design parameters, may be varied and further experiments conducted until such time that the outcome is known or able to be determined. A failed or abandoned experiment may still be eligible if the necessary criteria are met. If we're to look back at that legislative definition, it states that core R&D activities are experimental activities whose outcome cannot be known or determined in advance on the basis of current knowledge, information, or experience. The unknown outcome identified must focus on the technical or scientific ideas being explored and what is being done by the company to investigate those ideas. In other words, those parts which investigate the causal relationships among relevant variables. Whether an outcome can be known or determined in advance without applying a relevant systematic progression of work is judged by whether a competent professional in the field knows or could have determined the outcome without conducting an experiment as part of a systematic progression of work, and on the basis of worldwide knowledge, information, or experience that is publicly available or reasonably accessible. AusIndustry expects applicants to search worldwide for an existing way to achieve their outcome before they identify the need to conduct R&D activities. Records should also be kept to justify how the company determined that there was a gap in knowledge, requiring them to conduct R&D. For example, applicants could undertake a search of Google, computer science journals, major open source code repositories such as GitHub, or tech blogs, consult with a professional network, and ask questions on a tech forum. A company must also show that core R&D activities are conducted for the purpose of generating new knowledge. New knowledge must relate to knowledge that is new to the world, or not reasonably available to a competent professional in the relevant field. A competent professional for the purposes of AusIndustry's assessment is a person who has knowledge, skills, and experience in a field that relates to the R&D activity being conducted. It is not sufficient that the knowledge is just new to the organisation conducting the research. In some cases, knowledge might be known or likely to exist, but is not known publicly because of confidentiality. If this is the case, it will still be new under the definition of core R&D activities. To generate new knowledge, the completion of the core R&D activity within a software development project would be expected to be dependent on a scientific and/or technological advance. It's also important to note that there are a list of activities specifically excluded from being core R&D activities. These, however, may be supporting R&D activities if they're directly related to one or more core R&D activities, and they're undertaken for the dominant purpose of supporting core R&D activities. Developing, modifying, or customizing software for the dominant purpose of use in an R&D company's own internal administration is excluded from being registered as core R&D activity. Other activities may be unlikely to be core R&D activities because they do not necessarily involve a systematic progression of work, nor do they necessarily have the purpose of generating new knowledge. These may be core R&D activities in specific cases, but again, it's unlikely. Examples of these types of activities include bug testing, user acceptance, beta or requirements testing, testing the efficiency of different algorithms that are already known to work, testing websites in operation by measuring the number of hits, or routine computer and software maintenance. If an activity does not meet the core R&D activities eligibility criteria itself, but is directly related to, and in some cases also undertaken for the dominant purpose of supporting a core R&D activity, it may still be allowed by the program as a supporting R&D activity. To be directly related, an activity must have a direct, close, or relatively immediate relationship with one or more core R&D activities. Activities that make a direct contribution to the conduct or evaluation of the experiment are likely to meet this requirement. You cannot, however, claim for a supporting R&D activity that is not directly related to an eligible core R&D activity. It is not enough for the activity to simply be part of the same project. It must be directly related to a core R&D activity. Supporting R&D activities might include background research, setting up test beds, coding algorithms that will be used in an experiment, and collating data samples that will be used to conduct a relevant experiment. In some cases, activities may only be eligible as supporting R&D activities if they are also undertaken for the dominant purpose of supporting a core R&D activity. This additional requirement occurs when activities are purposefully excluded from being a core R&D activity, in the case of, say, software for internal administration, market research, market testing, or market development, or if the activities produce or are directly related to producing goods or services. In these cases, the activities will not be eligible if the purpose for supporting core R&D activities was of secondary importance. To satisfy the dominant purpose test, the purpose of undertaking the claimed supporting R&D activities must be the most important purpose. Some software development work conducted may use known methodologies or techniques. However, it's important to show that they were conducted either as part of a systematic progression of work within a core R&D activity, or as supporting R&D activities and directly supporting a core R&D activity. These activities and methods may include, for example, system testing, requirements testing, data mapping and data migration testing, testing the efficiency of different algorithms that are already known to work, testing websites in operation by measuring the number of hits, digital transformation activities such as transforming predominantly manual processes to digital, upgrading technology, routine computer software and maintenance, or data manipulation. After assessing eligibility, companies need to register activities with AusIndustry and then claim the offset through their income tax return with the ATO. You need to apply to register within 10 months of the end of the income year in which you conduct your eligible R&D activities. For example, a company that conducted eligible activities in the financial year ending 30 June 2021 has until 30 April 2022 to register those activities. AusIndustry will issue you with a registration number, which is then entered into the R&D schedule in your annual income tax return. It's worth noting that you may be able to claim a project or activity even if it's terminated early. It's not necessary for your experiments to be successful. If an experiment returns a negative result, this may still be an outcome that could not be known or determined in advance, and you can still have the purpose of generating new knowledge. If you terminate an activity or project after completing a supporting R&D activity, but not the core R&D activity it supports, you must be able to clearly demonstrate with records that you had an intention to conduct the relevant core R&D activity. Record keeping is a vital part of claiming the R&D tax incentive. Software developers may not be used to keeping extensive records, particularly if they adopt agile methodologies. However, AusIndustry expects you to keep records so that you can provide them in the case of a review. You can also make use of less formal records, such as screenshots, instant messaging histories, and exported content from task tracking or project management tools. The software guidance provides some examples of records you may keep. For example, to show the outcome of the experiments could not have been known or determined in advance, you may want to keep records of literature reviews, email exchanges with industry experts, screenshots of questions posted on tech blogs, or details of failed attempts to use existing technology. As another example, to show that activities followed a systematic progression of experimental works, you may want to keep records of each step of your experimental activity, code repositories, software versions, details of your testing strategy and approach, or project management documentation such as Gantt charts. This is of course not an exhaustive list. That concludes this presentation on assessment of software R&D activities. Should you have any questions, feel free to get in touch with our office. There's also additional material available on our website, as well as the website of the ATO and AusIndustry. Thank you.